Charlotte wins when Margaret burst into the bridal chamber and found the window open, the curtains snapping in the wind, and the wedding dress crumpled on the floor. distance of Halstead, offering rewards for any information about Nathaniel Cole's movements or about a woman matching Charlotte's description being transported by ship or carriage. Months passed with only false leads and dead ends, sightings that led nowhere, rumors that dissolved under closer examination. By the third month, most of the investigators Edmund had hired began to lose confidence in the search, suggesting that Nathaniel might have taken Charlotte overseas entirely, beyond any reach their inquiries could hope to achieve. Edmund refused to accept this possibility, not because it was impossible, but because accepting it meant giving up, and he had promised himself the night of the failed rescue that he would never again let Charlotte slip away without a fight. He began spending his own time at the docks in the city, speaking directly with sailors and merchants who might have crossed paths with Nathaniel's ships, learning the rhythms of the shipping trade well enough to understand which routes a man like Nathaniel might favor if he wished to move someone quietly between ports without drawing attention. It was slow, exhausting work, filled with far more failure than success, but by the 6th month, a pattern began to emerge from the scattered fragments of information Edmund had gathered. Nathaniel's ships, though registered under different names to obscure their ownership, followed a consistent route along the southern coast, stopping at a handful of smaller ports that larger shipping companies typically avoided. One of these ports, a town called Faro, appeared more frequently in the pattern than any other, suggesting it might serve as more than a simple stop along the trade route. Edmund began to suspect Faro might be where Nathaniel had established a new hiding place, one built with the lessons learned from the failure at Marrow Point. He traveled to Faro with Henry once again, though this time they moved with far greater caution than before, aware that Nathaniel would be watching for exactly this kind of pursuit after their previous close encounter. They spent weeks in the town, gathering information slowly and carefully, never asking direct questions that might raise suspicion, instead building relationships with local merchants and dock workers who gradually revealed small pieces of the picture Edmund needed. It was during this period, nearly 8 months after Charlotte's disappearance, that Edmund received the most devastating piece of information since the failed rescue at Marrow Point. A dock worker, after several weeks of careful conversation and modest bribes, admitted that he had seen a woman matching Charlotte's description boarding a ship bound not for another domestic port, but for a destination across the sea entirely, a journey that would place her far beyond the reach of any search conducted within the country's own borders. The news struck Edmund harder than the physical blow he had received at Marrow Point months earlier. If Charlotte had truly been taken overseas, the search that had already consumed most of a year might stretch on indefinitely, with dwindling odds of success as the trail grew colder with every passing week. He considered, for the first time since the wedding day itself, whether the search was truly hopeless, whether he had spent months chasing a woman who might now be entirely beyond his reach. Henry, sensing his friend's despair, refused to let him give up so easily. He pointed out that a dock worker's memory, however detailed, could easily be mistaken, especially after so many weeks had passed since the sighting he described. More importantly, Henry argued, if Nathaniel had truly succeeded in moving Charlotte overseas, he would have little reason to continue his elaborate efforts at secrecy within the country itself. The fact that his ships still followed their careful, obscured routes along the domestic coast suggested he still had reason to fear discovery close to home, which meant Charlotte, or at least some crucial piece of evidence about her whereabouts, likely remained within reach. Edmund clung to this reasoning, though doubt continued to gnaw at him through the following weeks. They redirected their efforts toward identifying every property Nathaniel owned or had access to within a reasonable distance of Faro, working through public records and quiet conversations with officials willing to share information for the right price. The work was tedious and frustrating, filled with dead ends that consumed weeks of effort only to reveal nothing useful, but Edmund refused to abandon it, driven by a stubborn conviction that Charlotte was still alive, still waiting, somewhere within reach of a search determined enough to find her. As the 10th month of searching approached, with winter beginning to settle over the coast and the anniversary of the abandoned wedding drawing closer with each passing day, Edmund began to fear that his own resolve might finally be reaching its limits, not from any weakening of his love for Charlotte, but from the simple, exhausting weight of a search that seemed to offer no end in sight. It was at this point, when hope had grown thin and the investigators around him had largely given up expecting success, that a single letter arrived that would change everything he understood about where Charlotte had been hidden all along. The letter arrived on an ordinary morning, delivered not by a mysterious boy paid to vanish before questions could be asked, but through the regular post, addressed in handwriting Edmund recognized instantly despite not having seen it in almost a year. It was Charlotte's own hand, unmistakable in its careful, slanted letters, The same handwriting that had once filled notes of affection sent during their brief courtship before the wedding that never happened. His hands trembled as he broke the seal, half afraid that the letter might contain more heartbreak, another false claim designed to end his search. But as he read the first lines, relief flooded through him so powerfully that he had to sit down before his legs gave way beneath him. Charlotte had written the letter herself, smuggled out through a servant girl at the property where she was currently being held, a place she described only vaguely for fear the letter might be intercepted before reaching him, but with enough detail that Edmund immediately recognized it as somewhere near Faro, exactly where his instincts had led him. She wrote that she had been moved twice since Marrow Point, each time to a more isolated location, as Nathaniel grew increasingly desperate and paranoid about discovery. She described her current situation as a house near a cliff overlooking the sea, isolated from any nearby village, staffed by only a handful of people whose loyalty to Nathaniel seemed to waver more with each passing month, as his behavior grew increasingly erratic. She wrote that Nathaniel had begun speaking of leaving the country entirely, taking her with him against her will if necessary, convinced that remaining much longer would inevitably lead to his capture. The letter ended with words that Edmund read over and over until the paper nearly wore thin from his touch. She had never stopped believing he would find her. Every day of her captivity, through every move to a new location, through every threat and every lonely night, she had held on to the memory of their brief reunion at Marrow Point, as proof that he had not given up on her, and she begged him to come quickly, before Nathaniel's growing desperation turned into something far more dangerous than captivity. Edmund summoned Henry immediately, and together they began working through everything Charlotte's letter had described, cross-referencing her mention of a cliffside house near the sea with the property records they had already gathered over the preceding weeks. It did not take long to identify a promising match, an isolated estate purchased 8 months earlier under yet another false name, situated exactly where Charlotte's letter suggested, along a stretch of coastline known locally for its dangerous cliffs and treacherous currents. There was no time to waste on careful surveillance this time, no luxury of days spent observing from a distance as they had done at Marrow Point. Charlotte's letter made clear that Nathaniel's patience was running out, that he might act on his threat to flee the country at any moment, taking her somewhere Edmund's search would never be able to follow. Every hour spent planning was an hour that brought them closer to losing her entirely, this time perhaps for good. Edmund gathered a small group of trusted men, former soldiers Henry had recommended for their discretion and their capability, unwilling to risk another failure like the one that had cost them so dearly at Marrow Point. They rode through the day and into the evening, pushing their horses harder than was wise across the rough coastal roads, arriving within sight of the cliffside property just as the last light faded from the sky. The house stood exactly as Charlotte had described it, perched near the edge of a cliff with the sound of waves crashing against rocks far below carrying up through the darkness. A single light burned in an upstairs window, and Edmund felt the same surge of desperate hope he had experienced outside the house at Marrow Point, tempered now by the harder lessons learned from that earlier failure. He would not rush in blindly again. He would not risk losing Charlotte to his own impatience a second time. Henry took charge of positioning the men around the property's perimeter, ensuring that any attempt to move Charlotte away from the house through a hidden exit would be immediately noticed and blocked. Edmund himself, along with 2 of the most capable men, approached the main entrance directly, having learned from Prudence's account at Marrow Point that a direct confrontation, handled correctly, could sometimes prove more effective than a stealthy approach that risked discovery at the worst possible moment. A single manservant answered the door, and unlike the household staff at Marrow Point, this man showed no hesitation or divided loyalty. He attempted to close the door immediately upon seeing Edmund's face, clearly having been warned to expect exactly this kind of intrusion, but Edmund's men were faster, forcing their way inside before the door could be secured. The manservant shouted an alarm that echoed through the house, and within seconds, the sound of running footsteps and raised voices confirmed that Nathaniel Cole was indeed present, and that this confrontation would not end quietly. Edmund pushed past the struggling manservant and moved toward the staircase, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and fierce determination. He had spent nearly a year of his life searching for this moment, had endured a devastating failure and months of dead ends and false hope, and he would not allow anything, not fear, not caution, not even the very real danger of the confrontation unfolding around him, to stop him from reaching Charlotte now that he was finally close enough to touch her again. Nathaniel appeared at the top of the stairs, and the change in his appearance since their last encounter at Marrow Point struck Edmund immediately, even in the chaos of the moment. He looked thinner, his eyes carrying the hollow, restless look of a man who had spent months living in fear of exactly this kind of discovery. sleeping poorly and trusting no one, his once confident bearing replaced by something closer to desperation. He held a pistol in his hand, aimed not at Edmund, but toward the corridor behind him, where Charlotte's voice suddenly rang out, calling Edmund's name with a mixture of fear and disbelief. The sight of the weapon froze everyone in the entrance hall for a long, terrible moment. Nathaniel's hand shook slightly as he held it, and Edmund understood with sudden, clear-eyed certainty that this was not a man calmly executing a plan, but a man who had backed himself into a corner with no remaining options, capable of anything in his final desperate attempt to keep what he had convinced himself belonged to him. Edmund raised his hand slowly, speaking in the calmest voice he could manage despite the fear coursing through him, telling Nathaniel that the house was surrounded, that there was no path remaining that led anywhere but capture, and that harming anyone now would only ensure a far harsher judgment than whatever punishment he already faced for what he had already done. He appealed not to Nathaniel's sense of mercy, which seemed entirely absent in the man's current state, but to whatever remained of his self-interest, the same calculating instinct that had built his shipping fortune and orchestrated an elaborate year-long deception. For a moment, it seemed as though the appeal might work. Nathaniel's shoulders sagged slightly, the pistol wavering in his grip as exhaustion and desperation warred visibly across his features. But then Charlotte appeared in the corridor behind him, having slipped past whatever guard had been posted at her door in the chaos of the confrontation, and the sight of her moving freely, clearly intending to reach Edmund despite the danger, seemed to snap something loose in Nathaniel's already fraying composure. He turned toward her, and for one horrifying instant, Edmund believed he might actually use the weapon against the woman he claimed to love, driven by a final, twisted logic that if he could not have her, no one would. Edmund moved without thinking, closing the distance between them faster than caution would have allowed, close enough to grab Nathaniel's arm just as the pistol fired, the shot going wide into the ceiling as the two men grappled for control of the weapon. The struggle was brief but violent, both men driven by desperation of very different kinds, until one of Edmund's men reached the top of the stairs and pulled Nathaniel away, wresting the pistol from his grip and forcing him to the ground with practiced efficiency. Nathaniel struggled for a moment longer, then seemed to collapse entirely, all the fight draining out of him at once as the reality of his failed plan finally settled over him. Edmund barely registered any of it. He was already moving toward Charlotte, who stood frozen in the corridor, staring at the scene before her with an expression caught between shock and overwhelming relief. This time, there was no interruption, no sudden arrival of reinforcements to tear them apart before they could reach each other. Edmund pulled her into his arms and she clung to him with a desperation that spoke to every month of fear and isolation she had endured, her whole body shaking as the tension of nearly a year finally broke. They stood together in that corridor for a long moment, neither speaking, simply holding on to the reality that this time, finally, the search had truly ended. Around them, Henry's men secured Nathaniel and the remaining household staff, while Henry himself climbed the stairs to find his friend, relief evident on his own face at the sight of Charlotte alive and safe in Edmund's arms after everything they had endured to reach this moment. Charlotte spoke first, her voice hoarse from disuse and emotion, asking if this was truly real, if she was truly free after so many months of believing she might never see him again. Edmund answered by simply holding her tighter, unable to find words adequate to the moment, allowing his presence alone to answer the question her fear had not yet allowed her to fully believe. It would take hours to sort through everything that followed, arranging for Nathaniel's transport back to face formal judgment for his crimes, questioning the household staff to determine who among them had acted out of genuine loyalty, and who had simply been too frightened to refuse their employer's demands, and beginning the long process of helping Charlotte recover from nearly a year of captivity and fear. But in that first moment, standing together in the corridor of the house where her ordeal had finally ended, none of that mattered yet. What mattered was that Edmund had kept the promise he made to himself on the night of the wedding that never happened, that he had refused to accept the easy story society wanted to tell, and that his stubborn, unwavering search had finally, after everything, brought Charlotte home. News of Charlotte's rescue reached the city long before Edmund and his party did, carried ahead by messengers he sent the moment the situation at the cliffside house had been fully secured. By the time their carriage rolled through the familiar streets toward the Winslow estate, crowds had already gathered outside the gates, drawn by rumors that had spread through every drawing room and market stall in the days since the news first broke. The scandal that had once painted Charlotte as a runaway bride now transformed, almost overnight, into a story of survival and devotion that captured the attention of the entire city. Charlotte's father met them at the gate, his face a mixture of relief and shame as he helped his daughter down from the carriage. He had spent nearly a year prioritizing the family's reputation over the truth of what had happened to his daughter, and the weight of that choice was visible in the way he could barely meet Edmund's eyes as he expressed his gratitude. Charlotte, exhausted but composed, accepted her father's embrace without the anger Edmund half expected her to show, though he noticed the careful distance she maintained even within the embrace, a distance that suggested forgiveness would take considerably longer than a single reunion to fully arrive. The following weeks were consumed by the practical matters that inevitably follow such an ordeal. Nathaniel Cole stood before a formal inquiry, where the full extent of his deception finally came to light. Investigators uncovered evidence of the false letters he had sent to Edmund, the payments made to silence witnesses at Merrill Point, and testimony from the household staff at the Cliffside estate who, freed from their fear of Nathaniel's control, spoke openly about the months of captivity they had witnessed. The evidence against him proved overwhelming, and he was sentenced to a lengthy term of imprisonment, his shipping fortune seized to compensate for the crimes committed in pursuit of a woman who had never once, in nearly a year of captivity, given him the affection he so desperately believed he deserved. Charlotte herself was called to testify, and though the experience was difficult, she approached it with a quiet strength that impressed everyone who witnessed her account. She described the fear of that first night, dragged from her own wedding morning by men she did not know, the isolation of Merrill Point, the devastating disappointment of watching Edmund pulled away from her just as rescue seemed within reach, and the long, uncertain months that followed as Nathaniel moved her from place to place, always one step ahead of discovery. She spoke of writing letters she never knew would reach anyone, of holding on to hope through sheer stubbornness even as the days blurred together into an indistinguishable stretch of fear and waiting. Through it all, Edmund remained beside her, though he understood, with a patience he had not always possessed before this ordeal, that Charlotte needed time and space to process everything that had happened before either of them could think about resuming the life the wedding had once promised. He did not press her about the future, did not assume that the relief of rescue meant she was ready to simply return to where they had left off nearly a year earlier. Instead, he focused on being present, visiting regularly, listening when she wished to talk, and remaining quiet when she did not. It was Charlotte herself, nearly 2 months after her rescue, who first raised the subject of the wedding that had never taken place. They sat together in the garden of her family estate, the same garden where Nathaniel had once cornered her with his threats 2 nights before the ceremony, a place Charlotte had deliberately chosen to reclaim rather than avoid. She told Edmund that she had spent much of her captivity thinking not just of rescue, but of everything that had been stolen from her that day, the wedding itself, the simple joy of beginning a new life with a man she loved, replaced instead by fear and uncertainty that had consumed nearly a year of her life. She did not want Nathaniel's actions to also steal the future she had once imagined for herself. She told Edmund, with a steadiness that surprised even herself, that she still wanted to marry him, not to erase what had happened, which she knew would remain part of her for the rest of her life, but to prove to herself that she could still choose her own path forward, that fear and captivity had not permanently taken that choice away from her. Edmund felt something loosen in his chest that had remained tight since the morning he stood alone at the altar, watching the church doors that never opened. He had never doubted his love for Charlotte through the long months of searching, but he had genuinely wondered whether she would ever feel safe enough again to stand before a crowd and speak vows that had once been interrupted so violently. Her decision to reclaim that moment, rather than simply move past it in private, spoke to a resilience that only deepened his admiration for her. They agreed the second ceremony would look nothing like the first. Where the original wedding had been a grand affair, filled with hundreds of guests and elaborate preparations that had taken months to arrange, this ceremony would be small, intimate, limited to only their closest family and friends, held not in the same church where the first attempt had ended in chaos, but in a quiet chapel near Edmund's own estate, chosen specifically because it carried none of the painful associations of the original venue. Charlotte insisted on one particular detail that Edmund readily agreed to without hesitation. She wanted Margaret present, the maid who had first discovered her absence and who had remained loyal and supportive throughout the entire ordeal, offering comfort during the difficult weeks of testimony and recovery that followed the rescue. Margaret, overwhelmed at being included in such an intimate gathering, wept openly when Charlotte extended the invitation personally, understanding the significance of being chosen to witness this second chance at the ceremony that had once been so violently disrupted. The weeks leading up to the second wedding passed with a quiet, careful joy that felt entirely different from the anxious excitement that had preceded the first attempt. Charlotte's father, still working to rebuild the trust his earlier choices had damaged, threw himself into the preparations with a humility Edmund had not seen from him before, deferring entirely to Charlotte's wishes rather than imposing his own ideas about how the ceremony should be conducted. It was, in its own way, a quiet form of apology, one that Charlotte accepted gradually, allowing her father back into her life at a pace that felt right to her, rather than rushing toward a forgiveness she did not yet fully feel. On the morning of the second wedding, nearly 14 months after the first attempt had ended in disappearance and fear, Charlotte dressed in a simple gown far less elaborate than the one she had worn on that first, interrupted morning. She told Edmund later that she had chosen the simplicity deliberately, wanting nothing about this day to remind her of the panic and violence that had followed her original wedding attire. She wore no veil at all, a choice that carried its own quiet significance, given how the torn veil had become the first clue in the long search to find her. Edmund waited at the small chapel with far less anxiety than he had felt on the morning of the first wedding, though a small, persistent fear remained in the back of his mind, a lingering worry born from experience that something might once again go wrong before the ceremony could be completed. When the chapel doors finally opened and Charlotte appeared, walking toward him without hesitation, that fear dissolved entirely, replaced by a relief and joy so complete that he found himself unable to speak for a long moment as she reached his side. The ceremony itself was brief, conducted by a minister who understood the weight of what this particular couple had endured to reach this moment. His words simple and heartfelt rather than the elaborate formal language typical of grander weddings. When it came time for vows, Charlotte spoke first, her voice steady and clear despite the tears gathering in her eyes, promising not just her love and devotion, but her determination to never again let fear dictate the choices she made about her own life and happiness. Edmund's own vows echoed that same sentiment, a promise not just to love her, but to always believe her, to never again allow doubt or convenient explanations to stand between him and the truth of what she needed. When the minister finally pronounced them husband and wife, the small gathering of guests broke into applause far more genuine and heartfelt than the polite ceremony typical of society weddings, each person present having witnessed some part of the long, difficult journey that had led to this moment. Margaret wept openly again, joined this time by Charlotte's mother, who had spent the entire ordeal largely silent and overwhelmed, but who now embraced her daughter with a fierce, protective joy that spoke to everything she had feared losing over the preceding year. Henry, standing beside Edmund throughout the ceremony as he had stood beside him through every difficult month of the search, offered a simple toast at the small celebration that followed, praising not the dramatic rescue or the eventual justice served against Nathaniel Cole, but the quiet, stubborn persistence that had defined Edmund's entire search from the very first morning at the empty altar. He reminded the gathered guests that Edmund could have accepted the easier story, the one society had wanted to believe from the beginning, and that his refusal to do so was ultimately what had brought Charlotte home. As the celebration continued into the evening, Charlotte pulled Edmund aside for a quiet moment away from the gathered guests, finding a private corner of the garden where they could speak without the attention of well-wishers eager to hear every detail of their extraordinary story. She told him, with a gentle honesty that had become characteristic of her since the rescue, that she did not want their future together to be defined entirely by what had happened during her captivity, that she wanted to build new memories together that had nothing to do with fear or rescue or the year they had lost to Nathaniel's obsession. Edmund agreed completely, understanding that healing would be an ongoing process rather than something completed simply by exchanging vows a second time. But standing together in that quiet garden, with the sound of their small celebration continuing behind them and the first stars beginning to appear overhead, he allowed himself, for the first time since the morning of the first failed wedding, to simply feel grateful for the present moment, without the weight of fear or urgency that had defined nearly every day of the preceding year. They had both been changed by everything that happened, shaped by fear and separation, and the long, difficult search that had finally brought them back together. But standing there in the garden as newly married husband and wife, neither of them doubted that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, having already proven, through the hardest possible test, that their commitment to each other could survive even the darkest circumstances imaginable. 6 months into their marriage, a letter arrived that neither Edmund nor Charlotte expected, forwarded from the prison where Nathaniel Cole now served his sentence. It was not from Nathaniel himself, but from a lawyer representing him, requesting a formal meeting with Charlotte to discuss terms for an early release, based on claims of poor health and good behavior during his confinement. Edmund's first instinct was to refuse outright, to shield Charlotte from any further contact with the man who had stolen nearly a year of her life, but Charlotte surprised him by insisting she wanted to respond to the request herself, in writing, on her own terms. She spent an entire evening composing her reply, refusing Edmund's offers to help or advise her on the wording. When she finally shared the letter with him before sending it, he found it both measured and unflinching, a document that acknowledged no obligation toward Mercy, while making clear that she intended to attend any hearing regarding his release, and to testify, in full detail, about the actual conditions of her captivity, conditions the lawyer's letter had conveniently understated. She wanted the court, and anyone else who might one day encounter Nathaniel Cole's name, to understand exactly what he had done, without the softened language that powerful men so often use to minimize their own cruelty. The hearing took place 3 months later, and Charlotte insisted on attending without Edmund seated directly beside her, wanting the judges to see her standing on her own strength rather than sheltered behind her husband's presence. Edmund respected her wish, though he watched from a few rows back, proud beyond words at the composed, unwavering testimony she delivered, describing not just the fear of her captivity, but the long, difficult process of rebuilding trust and confidence in the months since her rescue. The judges denied Nathaniel's request for early release, extending his original sentence instead, after concluding that his lawyer's petition contained significant distortions of the actual circumstances of his crimes. Charlotte left the courtroom that day with a lightness Edmund had not seen in her since before the wedding, a visible sense of having reclaimed something Nathaniel's continued presence in her life, even from within a prison cell, had still managed to hold over her. She told Edmund afterward that facing him, even indirectly through the formal proceedings, had done more for her healing than any amount of quiet avoidance ever could have. She no longer felt like a woman something had happened to. She felt, for the first time in a long while, like a woman who had faced her fear directly and walked away stronger for it. In the months that followed, Charlotte began quietly using her own resources and connections to support other women who had experienced similar ordeals. Women whose disappearances or captivities had been dismissed by families more concerned with scandal than safety, exactly as her own father had once been. She worked initially through small, private efforts, funding legal assistance for women whose cases had been ignored by local authorities, and gradually this work grew into something more organized, a network of support that connected families willing to search seriously, with resources, and investigators capable of conducting exactly the kind of thorough inquiry that had eventually brought her home. Edmund supported this work fully, recognizing in Charlotte's growing determination the same stubborn refusal to accept convenient explanations that had once driven his own search for her. He often accompanied her to meetings with families desperate for help, offering his own experience and resources whenever they proved useful, though he was always careful to let Charlotte lead these efforts, understanding that her authority on the subject came from an experience he could support, but never fully claim as his own. Margaret, whose quick thinking on the morning of the first wedding had provided the earliest clues in the search, remained close to the family, eventually taking on a formal role helping coordinate the growing network of support Charlotte had built. She often told the story of that first morning to newer members of their circle, the overturned chair, the missing brooch, the torn veil caught on the window latch, always emphasizing how those small, easily dismissed details had ultimately proven the difference between a case abandoned as simple scandal and a search pursued with the seriousness it deserved. Henry remained a constant presence in their lives as well, his friendship with Edmund only deepened by everything they had endured together during the long search. He often joked, in the years that followed, that he had never expected his particular talent for asking uncomfortable questions to prove quite so useful in matters of the heart. Though beneath the humor, both men understood how close the search had come to failing entirely, and how much they owed to persistence, careful investigation, and a fair amount of fortunate timing along the way. Charlotte's relationship with her father continued to heal slowly, never fully returning to what it had been before his initial reluctance to take her disappearance seriously, but growing into something honest and functional over time, built on his gradual demonstration that he had truly learned from the mistakes of that first difficult year. He became, eventually, one of the strongest supporters of Charlotte's work helping other families, perhaps driven in part by his own lingering guilt over how nearly his instincts toward protecting reputation over truth had cost him his daughter entirely. As for Nathaniel Cole, he remained in prison for the full extended term the judges had imposed, his shipping fortune long since dispersed to cover the costs of his crimes and the compensation owed to those he had harmed along the way, including generous payments arranged for Prudence and her aunt, who had risked their own safety to help free Charlotte from Marrow Point. Charlotte occasionally received word of him through the formal channels connected to her advocacy work, updates on his continued confinement that she read with a detached interest, no longer touched by fear. simply confirming that justice, however slowly, continued to be served. 2 years after their second wedding, Edmund and Charlotte welcomed their first child, a daughter they named after Charlotte's grandmother, whose silver brooch Charlotte still wore every single day, the very piece of jewelry whose absence had first told Edmund, on that chaotic wedding morning, that something was deeply wrong. The brooch had been recovered among Nathaniel's possessions during the investigation, taken as one final act of control during her abduction, and its return to Charlotte on the day of the second wedding had carried a significance that went far beyond its modest monetary value. Charlotte often told their daughter, as she grew old enough to understand, a simplified version of the story that had shaped her parents' early years together, emphasizing not the fear or the danger, but the persistence and love that had ultimately triumphed over every obstacle placed in their path. She wanted her daughter to understand that even when circumstances seemed impossible, when the people meant to protect you failed to act, and when hope grew thin after months of disappointment, refusing to give up still mattered, still made a difference, still had the power to bring people home. Edmund, watching his wife share these stories with their growing family in the years that followed, often thought back to that terrible morning at the altar, watching the church doors that never opened, and marveled at how far they had traveled since then, through fear and separation, and a search that had tested every ounce of determination he possessed. He had promised himself, on that very first night, that he would not accept the easy story society wanted to tell about Charlotte's disappearance. Looking at his family now, gathered together in a life built from persistence and unwavering love, he understood that refusing to accept that easy story had been the most important decision he ever made.